Hello and welcome to this new edition of OMFG Sarkar. I'm your host Ash Sarkar at IO Caesar for the cyborgs among you, and today I'm going to try and answer one simple question. What is Islamophobia? Obviously, I could just say that Islamophobia refers to the discrimination of anyone perceived as Muslim in an era of seemingly endless wars on terror, and then I could just go home and you wouldn't have to watch the rest of this video. But I do think there are some pressing questions that need to be addressed. Namely, what is the relationship between Islamophobia and racism? How does it work as a method of social control? And what precisely is the threat posed by Muslimness to what we might call Western values? So the typical liberal humanist response to connecting Islamophobia to racism can be summed up as Islam isn't a race, ergo Islamophobia or criticism of Islam cannot be racist. Or as Sam Harris put it, Islam is not a race, an ethnicity or a nationality, it's a set of ideas. For Harris, racial identities and the nation state are essential and natural, i.e. we don't choose them, we aren't socialised into them, and as such are distinct from cultural and ideological identities like Islam. And for the most part, critics of this have relied on pointing out that you can't separate the idea of Islam from its social context. And the TLDR version of this critique runs that you can't absolve yourself of racism just by claiming the group that you're beefing aren't a race, especially if that group are overwhelmingly black, brown and Middle Eastern. And then the Sam Harrises and the Richard Dawkins of the world respond smugly that, well, we didn't bring up skin colour first, you did, so you're the real racists. And on and on and on until Poseidon finally decides to put us out of our misery and the seas swallow us up for good. And I reckon we're missing a trick here. For what it's worth, I do think Islamophobia differs from what we would traditionally think of as racism, which is scientific racism. And by that I mean the kinds of 19th and 20th century pseudoscientific discourses that proposed a taxonomy of the human based on phenotype. And they did this in order to justify imperialism and the subjugation of so-called inferior races. But scientific racism hasn't always been the only game in town. And as we discussed in the previous OMFG, early modern conceptions of race were entirely to do with sets of ideas and cultural practices, in particular the expulsions of the Jews, Moriscos and the Moors. So Islamophobia has deep connections to a much older form of cultural racism and, as Edward Said points out, has shared origins with anti-Semitism in Europe. He says that they have stemmed from the same source and been nourished by the same stream. Nick Robinson's notorious description of the Lee Rigby killers as being of Muslim appearance is meaningful not just because it marks a return to older forms of cultural racism, but because it operates as a catch-all term for visible racial otherness. It both strategically elides the discrete racial categories of scientific racism while simultaneously reinforcing them. And thinking about how Islamophobia works as a method of social control, I think it's critical to look at the relationship between the policing of subjectivities and the policing of bodies. And that's beyond just identifying Prevent as a racist and anti-democratic government policy. I think you've got to look at gender and Islamophobia together. This week, David Cameron spoke at length on the incompatibility of British values with the socially segregated condition of Muslim women in the UK. He blamed Muslim menfolk for preventing women from learning English, leaving the house, and subjecting them to nothing but ISIS propaganda and FGM. Now, I'm not saying for 1 minute that Muslim women, queers, trans and non-binary folk aren't subjected to violence and to patriarchal oppression. I mean, we live in the same society as you. This emphasis on Islamic gender relations is not only a continuation of the old imperialism of white men saving brown women from brown men, but speaks to the brown femme body being territorialised by the state. The patriarchal set of ideas, as embodied by the Muslim subject in the Western cultural imagination, is not disputed at the level of ideas. It's controlled by the policing of bodies. The government isn't opposing FGM through thoughtful community work, but by locking people up. And migrants aren't being encouraged to learn English because of well-funded and accessible classes, but through the threat of deportation. And Muslim women aren't being empowered because of an inclusive, dynamic, effective, intersectional feminist movement, but through the spectre of forced unveiling and through a narrative that insists on the uniquely brutal misogyny amongst Muslim men. And I think it's absolutely crucial to note that the mechanisms being presented as solutions to the gender depression faced by Muslims, more policing, more incarcerations, more deportations, are gender depressions in themselves. And you only have to look at the horrors endured by the women of Yarl's Wood, or recall the so-called virginity testing imposed on South Asian migrants at Heathrow, to see that the logic of carceral nationalism is perhaps the most perfect expression of violent misogyny that exists in our society. So, what is Islamophobia? It's a set of state structures as well as an overall cultural disposition. And I think it's evidence that in the 21st century we have not seen an end to racism, but the proliferation of many racisms. What does this mean for anti-racism? It means that the scale of the task ahead of us is huge. It could mean talking the abolition of Europe, it could mean talking the abolition of the state, and it definitely means talking the abolition of race. But what do you think? Let us know. Use the hashtag OMFGSarkar, holler at me at IOCaesar, or just abuse the organisation as a whole at Navara Media. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.